Hello and welcome to Articulate Studies of Religion, three versions of Paul or more, and Christian bioethics. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia and recognize their continuing connection to land, water, and culture. I'm currently on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country in which you're on and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. As we share our knowledge, teaching, learning, and research practices within the university, may we also pay our respects to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. Alrighty, so this is an outline of what we will cover in the webinar tonight. I will quickly run through some housekeeping and then we will hear from Dr. Chris Hartney on St. Paul and Christian bioethics. So tonight's webinar is delivered in partnership with our Discipline of Studies in Religion here at the university, and it couldn't have been possible without Dr. Chris Hartney and his willingness to share his expertise and insight in these topics. We're very excited to cover this in our Articulate Talk series this year, particularly as they were a request from high schools, and we very much appreciate all your contribution and ideas in designing this talk. Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much, Joyce, and thanks to Joyce and Charlotte for all of the work they've done in getting this together. Let us start with Saul of Tarsus, who becomes St. Paul the Evangelist. And what I've planned for today in the two topic areas that we're going to look at is to give you a little bit of an idiosyncratic view of what's going on with these two subjects, mainly because your teachers are very good at extolling the details of the syllabus. They're very good at coming up with ways and strategies to address the questions that will be in the HSC. And some of them are also very good at predicting the cycle of questions and what sorts of questions will be coming up in a given year. I'm not that sort of person. I'm somebody who is on the other side of the whole syllabus and can give you some academic views of what's going on. And hopefully those academic views can amplify or at least challenge some of the approaches that you're meeting in the classroom. So I want to go into, first of all, who was Paul, but as time is short, I'll keep his biographical details very brief. And then I've come up with 5 paradigms, 5 prisms, 5 lenses for how we might be able to understand his impact. Some of these might be a little bit complicated. Some of them might be very easy. Hopefully some of them are inspiring to you as well, to give you ways of thinking through the sort of impact that Paul has on the very early community. And here you can see an image by Caravaggio, which was done in 1600 in that wonderful light and dark process of painting that Caravaggio was able to do. And this is hanging in the church of Santa Maria del Popolo in Rome, so that when you go into the church, you see this extraordinary vision of a man who has fallen down on the highway. He's gone blind, and he is having a complete conversion experience from being a persecutor of Christians into somebody who's going to go on to become central to the development of Christianity as an organizational structure and a movement. But I don't want you to think of this story as bland and boring. It has some incredible drama to it. And that drama is, of course, the drama of somebody who is developing a new religious experience within the Roman Empire. And as we know from looking at how new religions don't really fit into our world, I think of the controversies behind Scientology and a whole range of other mind-controlling cults, as the media tells us they are. You can see how challenging and how difficult it must have been for this small group of early followers of Jesus to push back against the very powerful structures of social expectation and power that were alive in the Roman Empire at the time. So here's 5 ways of understanding his impact Firstly, as an organizer, and we might call that the standard view. And many people write about Paul as somebody who constructs Christian communities, somebody who is a church planter, somebody who's a community organizer. And we find that particularly through his letters. And I think most Christians would agree that without him, Christianity wouldn't have the structure and the growth that it does in those very early years. I want to introduce you in the second paradigm to a strange word. Syncretismos is the Greek concept. And syncretism is the putting together of religious ingredients that exist prior to a new religion developing, but which that new religion relies upon to be understood and to be attractive to the people to which it is appealing to. I also want to talk about Paul as the first figure of Christian literacy. And when you look at the great history of the religions of the world, there's this enormous struggle between orality and literacy. Orality is a world in which you don't need texts, or a world in which texts are not used or haven't been invented. Orality is a modality of thinking that encourages people to keep vast amounts of information in their head. They can keep traditions alive through poetry, through telling epic stories. They can make contracts by making oaths before fire or before water in order to seal, or before gods, of course, to seal their compacts and make economic contracts without paper, without writing. So that world of orality, we might say, is the world in which Jesus lived. Jesus is not writing things down. The people who were very close to Jesus are not, while he's alive, writing things down either. It is not a world of literacy. It's a world of orality. And this is not unusual when you look at the early life of Buddha, or the early the career of the Prophet Muhammad. You see that they are giving oral teachings, but they are not necessarily putting things down on paper in the first instance. And we're going to look at how Paul is a major agent in that movement from an oral Christian world into a literate Christian world. We might say that he is a remoralizer. That is, that he sees Jesus as cancelling the ancient covenant or contract between the Jewish people and Yahweh. So how is it that in his writings he comes up with new ways of conceiving of how Christians should behave ethically and morally? And then finally, it's a difficult issue that I want to speak about, but Paul is often seen as having Protestant sympathies. He's somebody who's associated with text, with evangelism, and with a whole range of other things that are focused on what we take today to be a Protestant mindset. And maybe I want to talk to you about that as a kind of trap of thinking that you might fall into if you're not terribly careful. So let's move to the next slide, Joyce, which is where we're focusing on the biography of Paul. He lived in that range of dates that you can see there. He started off, and his early life, he was clearly a certified member of the Jewish community, and more than that, he was a Pharisee. And Pharisees were traditional Jews. They were following Rabbi Hillel. And Rabbi Hillel, if you want to follow up on that tradition, says a lot of the things that Jesus also says about loving your neighbor and about turning the other cheek and so forth. But the Pharisees were dedicated to keeping Judaism traditional. And this is a very interesting conservative point of view for Paul to have. He also had Roman citizenship. Not everybody in the Roman Empire had Roman citizenship, so this gave him extra legal protection to travel where he went and to say the things that he did. He sought to remove the potential breakaway sect of Christ followers who seemed to be gathering at the back of synagogues. They were worshipping as Jews worshipped, but they kept to themselves and also kept alive the idea that Jesus was a Messiah, or was the Messiah, the person who had come to confirm the contract between Yahweh and the Jewish people, and that as a Messiah, he was going to bring a tremendous moment of change where the kingdom of Yahweh would be opened. Perhaps it would be a case where the Jews who had died would have bodily resurrection and would be able to access that kingdom of Yahweh either here on earth or in some other realm. So at this stage, Paul is still clearly Jewish and also very worried about Judaism turning into something new. He travels to Damascus to find Christians in the Jewish community there and to persecute them, to get them out of the synagogues, to say, hey, you're not being as Jewish as you should be. And it's interesting that on the road to Damascus, he does a complete 180. If you remember back to that picture of Caravaggio, he falls on the ground, he goes blind for 3 days. He hears voices saying, go to the Christians, they will return to you your sight. And it's at this stage, this sophisticated, literate Jewish person with a conservative Jewish attitude suddenly joins the Christian community and begins working for the Christians instead of against them. He goes on to become the most central organizer and developer of early Christian communities. He's called the evangelist because if he does something radical, he takes a Jewish message that is designed for Jewish people and understood within the atmosphere of Judaism, that a Jewish Messiah has come to rearrange the structure of the Jewish world. He then takes that message outside of the Jewish community and puts it into a form that can be understood by the Gentiles, can be understood by Roman citizens and other people living in the Roman Empire who are not Jewish, who are not circumcised, who are not eating by the strictures of Jewish dietary laws, but who are living generally in the Roman Empire. And he gave Christianity its mechanism of conversion and universal appeal. So if we can go to the next slide, Joyce, thank you. So as Christianity's first organizer, here's paradigm one. We might say this is a standard Christian view of him. But we have to place Paul between three very potent contexts, and they are, he is clearly a Jew before his conversion, and after his conversion, he still remains cognizant, understanding of all of the aspects of Jewish life, of Jewish dietary laws, of Jewish behavior. So that is within him. He never loses that. But he is also now, once he is converted, working with early Christian communities who are slowly moving out of the synagogues, up the back of the synagogues, and embracing a wider community than just Jews alone. Moreover, he is within the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire has gone through a very particular change. It is now being led by Caesar Augustus, and Caesar Augustus brings about the Pax Romana. He is the actual Prince of Peace. He calls himself Princeps. First in the empire, he takes on a monarchical sort of leadership role in the Roman Empire, which is confirmed later on when his adopted son becomes Princeps after him, Tiberius. And during this Augustan and Tiberian period, we have universal peace extending throughout the Roman Empire after some very bad civil wars. And it's very interesting that one of the titles Caesar Augustus takes up is he declares on coinage and on buildings and on a whole range of other manifestations of his power that he is Dei Filius, he is the Son of God. And by that he means that he is the adopted son of Julius Caesar, who was given an apotheosis, which means that he was elevated to the status of a god. How did you get elevated to the status of a god in Rome? The Roman Senate voted you the honors of a god. And so Julius Caesar was so exceptional. After he was assassinated, the Roman Senate declared him to be a god. And as Augustus was his son, he then becomes the Son of God. Now, you can see that Paul and early Christians who are addressing Jesus or the Christ as the Son of God are using a language that the government also uses. So there's a great deal of tension here, and the accusation of treason is easily made. But what Paul is doing in continuing this idea that Jesus is very familiarly connected to God and is possibly God also, as we move towards the development of the doctrine of the Trinity, is that there is a political power play taking place here, and Paul is reimagining not Judaism as a thing that is in and of itself for Jewish people, but a new religious structure that seems to be like the imperial structure itself. And this is part of the syncretism that I'm going to talk about a little bit later on. So when Paul speaks of Christ as the Son of God, and when he uses terms such as the kingdom of heaven, he's potentially making very treasonous and political statements. And at this time, we can't say that early Christianity is a social organization that is completely apolitical and has nothing to do with the power structures of the Roman Empire. In fact, it's trying to connect itself very closely and allow it to be understood through that paradigm. Paul is adapting this imperial model. He makes exceptions for non-Jews to join a hitherto Jewish group. Can you allow non-Jews to eat with early Christians who are Jews? Paul says yes. Can you allow male new Christians to join the Christian community even if they haven't been circumcised? And Paul says yes. And he communicates this to a whole range of Jewish communities, Christian communities that are breaking away from Jewish communities in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. And he's doing this through his letters of advice to various communities as well. You can see this in operation in the primary sources, which is Paul's letters to the Romans, but more importantly, his second letter to the Corinthians. And these are the acknowledged legitimate letters of Paul. There are other letters that you can find in the New Testament that are by Paul, but scholars tend to suggest that they are written by somebody who is a pseudo-Paul. They're written in the style of Paul, but they're not necessarily by Paul. John Dominic Crossan is a very clever scholar and theologian who is looking at a range of significant literary, but also archaeological and inscription sources about the early life of the community. And his book is to be recommended, but he also summarizes his book on that YouTube video, which I encourage you to look at. Can we go to the next slide, please, Joyce? Now, here's a little intermission. This slide is only telling you one thing, and that is that Paul is taken by scholars to be the first Christian writer. So that when we look at all of the Gospels, when we look at the Acts of Apostles, everything that's in the New Testament, and we try and work out which of these came first, it seems as though those letters attributed to Paul are the first things that are being written and canonized in the Christian canon. You might see here there's a bizarre thing. You might think this is bizarre, called the Q source. This is German scholars in the 18th and 19th century identifying the fact that there are 200 lines in both Matthew and Mark that are very similar, which suggests that preceding Matthew and Mark, there was a written text telling a part of the story of Jesus's life that both Mark and Matthew draw from. That's called the Q source. The Q source is reasonably close to the letters of Paul, but it could very well be that the letters of Paul are the first thing written down, giving a sense of structure to the Christian community. Can we go to the next slide? So, is Paul an agent of syncretism? And you can see here in the image Bernini's incredible sculpture, again made in the early 1600s, of Apollo chasing Daphne. And this is an absolutely extraordinary piece of marble to look at, because as Apollo attempts to abduct Daphne, there is a curse that turns her into a tree. So you can see the bark is actually starting to grow around Daphne as Apollo attaches to her. Why am I speaking of Apollo? Because one of Apollo's names was Christ, Christos, meaning the golden one, the shining one. So when Paul speaks of Jesus as Christ, he is already affecting a syncretic move to take a Jewish concept, the Messiah, and give it a language in Greek that enables people who are not Jewish or not from that Semitic language atmosphere to begin to understand what's happening. Now, you can go onto the web and you can find all sorts of videos saying, well, Christianity is secretly a redesign of the cult of Mithra, who was a Roman deity that we don't know too much about, but that Christianity is a recontextualization of mystery religions. And I've got a link to a couple of academics online explaining what mystery religions are. But you can see that Christianity is taking little bits and pieces, even if it's just words, and using those to enable people of the Roman Empire to understand this new thing that has broken away from Judaism in the language, the context, and the cultural understanding that they are familiar with. And in this way, it is a syncretism. Christianity brings in themes from the Persian religion of Zoroastrianism, and it brings in other themes from mystery religions. But I think more than anything else, it gives Christianity a structure that is parallel to the structure of the Roman Empire. And I don't have the time to go so deeply into this, but Paul is an agent of syncretism by doing what he did, and that is taking the breakaway movement of Christianity focused in and of a group of Jewish people and moving it and making it appeal to and making it comprehensible to citizens of the Roman Empire and other people who dwell in the empire. So he's an agent of syncretism. That's one of his great impacts, is this ability to make Christianity more comprehensible. Can we go to the next slide, Joyce? So you can see here that if we call Jesus the Christ, we're linking him to Apollo. If we worship Jesus's birthday on the 25th of December, we are linking him to the figure of Mithra, and this is a statue here of Mithra. Mithra was extremely big in the Roman army, for example. Mithra had his worshipful date on the 25th of December as well. So you can see that there are syncretic movements in this direction as well. We can also understand Jesus through an Egyptian paradigm as a Horus-like figure who after death becomes God as Osiris. So this transmutation of the Son and the Father being imminently linked on earth, but then in heaven, there is this Trinitarian connection, is something that we could say is being drawn from Egyptian understandings. Richard Carrier will give you a, yes, Christianity is a mystery cult, or has been understood by its first joiners who are not Jewish as a mystery cult. And David Litwa is saying, oh, it's a bit more complicated than that. Let us be more critical. But these two videos will give you a sense of what's going on in the background to this syncretism that's taking place. At a scholarly level, we say that all religions are syncretic as they start. They must all be inclusive of older traditions, but repackage those older traditions in new ways. And Paul is helping Christianity do that. So this is a serious part of his impact. Can we go to paradigm number 3? This is a little bit complicated, but here I wanted to just say that there is a demarcation between orality and literacy that I pointed out before. And Walter Ong, who's a very good scholar and also a Jesuit priest, goes into that. Ong's methodology shows us what Paul is doing. He is taking an oral tradition, stories that were being spoken about Jesus's life, ministry, and crucifixion, and he is writing down what is happening there. So you might find useful, N.T. writes Paul a biography, where he is attempting to show how Paul goes on to create the philosophical space of Christian theology itself. And theology is not only a discussion, but is also something that's carried out at a textual level as well. And this YouTube clip will take you to N.T. Wright, who's a former bishop of the Church of England, into how Paul is making Christianity a textual thing. Can we go to the next paradigm, Charlotte? Now, here's intermission two. I just wanted to look briefly at Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, where Paul is saying that here we face a new covenant. In Judaism, there were 613 commandments. Maybe we can go to the next slide, Joyce. There were 613 commandments. You might know that there are 10 commandments, but those 10 are just part of the 613 that you can find in Leviticus, how Jews should live in order to maintain a connection between themselves and Yahweh. And Paul says in 2 Corinthians, no, there's a new contract now, and that contract is in you accepting into your heart the glory that is Jesus. But in parking those 613 rules about how to live a righteous life, Paul then starts to manifest some of the ways Christians should behave, and he does two interesting things. Two interesting things which are very controversial for liberal Christians today. We find in Corinthians 6:9, Paul suggests that homosexuals will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, if you go to that Bible Gateway verse, you will see a whole range of translations about this particular point. Is it that Paul is saying homosexuals will not enter the kingdom of heaven, or is he saying that male prostitutes, because Paul, when he stayed in Corinth, was staying very close to an area that we know was where male prostitutes hung out in Corinth? Is he saying male prostitutes will not enter the kingdom of heaven? Is he saying homosexuals will not enter the kingdom of heaven? Is he saying all people of non-heteronormative disposition will not enter the kingdom of heaven? That's an interesting point. He also says, most controversially, women should stay silent in church. So here he's put up two blocks to modern Christianity. If you are gay, you will not be able to access the kingdom of heaven. And we have had a very long history of intolerance towards the LGBTQI++ community from Christianity. Is Paul the source of that? And additionally, women as ministers, is that allowable? Again, we go back not to the covenant of the Jews now, but we go back to Paul as the authority for that. Now, of course, the problem is Paul was not Jesus. Jesus did not say things about homosexuality or the place of women in leadership. So why should we take Paul's word? Why is Paul able to have this remoralization of Christianity? Which leads us to the next slide, Joyce, which is the controversial statement made by John Shelby Spong. He reads Paul's letters and is very familiar with them in his long career as a bishop of the Episcopal Church in North America. He comes to the conclusions, reading Paul's statements, that psychologically Paul could have very well been a self-hating homosexual himself. Now, this is a radical thing to say, but I put it in not because I want to stir you up, but because it's coming from a very liberal churchman who is recognizing that Paul's impact on early Christianity is so important that maybe he needs to come up with readings of Paul's writings that enable him to undercut Paul, to challenge this idea that Christianity should be adverse to homosexuality and should be wary of women taking leadership roles in the church. So again, we can conclude that Paul's influence is so impactful on Christianity that he becomes a key person that the modernists and the liberals of the Christian church, John Shelby Spong truly believed he was trying to drag Christianity into the 21st century and make it popular amongst Western civilization again. And he did this by trying to battle against the absolutely potent influence that Paul has had. The next slide's a little bit complicated, but if we can turn to that one, Joyce. There's this Protestant view that has erupted in Christianity since 1519 when Martin Luther tried to reform the Catholic Church. He failed, and people who were following Martin Luther then broke away into Protestantism, and then Protestantism itself atomized into Presbyterianism and Anglicanism and Lutheranism and Methodism and Quakerism, a whole range of different views of how to read the text and how to interpret what righteousness means for a Christian. Now, Protestants are drawn to Paul because Paul is associated with text rather than community, it seems, and that Paul is very much connected to what the written word enables you to understand about the Christian community. But I just want to leave Paul by saying to you, be wary of this Protestant view. Religion and Christianity as well is not only a written thing. It is not only about what is in the Bible. It is about community. It is about authority. And for those of you who are Catholic, and I was brought up a Catholic, you will find that there are doctrines in the Catholic Church, such as the Dormition of Mary, how Mary ascended to heaven while she was asleep, of apostolic succession, how all of the popes are linked in their authority back to Jesus. These things are part of the doctrine of the Catholic Church that Protestants would say have no foundation in the text. So be wary of seeing Paul as just a modern text-focused evangelist and church planter. He was deeply connected also to the early Christian community by going and visiting and worshipping and speaking with them. He was far more complex than he would be if you just read him simply through a Protestant paradigm, which is very popular at the moment. Let us now move over to bioethics. Now, with bioethics, I don't want to go into the entire syllabus. And I really recommend to you Letitia Layton and Andy Martin. They've uploaded onto the web their teacher-focused breakdown of how you can approach Christian bioethics from a Catholic perspective, but I don't think their perspective is unduly Catholic. I think it will be useful to you all. And here they're trying to answer this question, describe and explain Christian ethical teachings on bioethics. That is, take a piece of Christian scripture or Christian doctrine or Christian action and relate that to some bioethical issues such as organ donation, such as abortion. But here I want to give you something that they don't do in their YouTube broadcast to the extent that I think they could have, and that is to look at Christianity as a living religious tradition. Because here you now need to put the history in. Where did these movements regarding organ donation, regarding abortion, where did they come from? And it's very interesting to see how recent a history some of these attitudes are. So let us look at a little bit of this history by going to the next slide, Joyce. Here is Vatican II. Vatican II was a church council set to redesign and refocus the Catholic Church for the modern world. So many changes happened to the operation of the Catholic Church at Vatican II. And the reason Vatican II was required, and most people don't go into this, but would you believe there was a Vatican I? And Vatican I was a great church council that was held in 1870 and 1871. And the problem with that council is that it was the Catholic Church declaring itself against modernity. We will not engage with modernity. We will rule that democracy is an aberration. We will rule that education outside of the Catholic Church is an aberration, that all forms of secularism are aberrations to the message of Jesus Christ. So Vatican I was a radically conservative mood, Vatican II was a far more liberating modality. Now, throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century, abortion goes from being a shifty practice of people in laneways or people who are practicing illegally to try and come up with potions that might be abortifying to stop pregnancy in some very unscientific ways. But of course, as science continues, medical science continues its rise throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, doctors work out how to surgically, hygienically, carefully, and quickly carry out abortions. This is part of the development of modernity. What will Christianity do when such a thing becomes accessible by the population? The Catholic Church asks a group of lay Catholics to try to come up with some attitudes to contraception and some attitudes to abortion. Those lay Catholics say, well, we can't see anything wrong with it. And at the last minute, they're overridden by a council of bishops who say, no, 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 we have to take humanity as and a human being as sacrosanct and as starting from that point of conception. Now, this idea was not always prevalent. So this is a reaction to modernity that takes off very strongly in the Catholic Church from 1965 onwards. But you can see here, and this is from the Roman Curia, which is the organization of the Catholic Church itself, saying, every life is inviolable right from the point of conception, and we prove this by referring you to Jeremiah 1 and to Psalm 139. Interestingly, those text footnotes to Scripture are to Old Testament, not to anything Jesus said, not to anything Paul said. So it's very interesting to see where this authority is coming from and how this reaction is taking place. If we can go to the next slide, then we can follow this through to some very interesting historical developments. Now, when the Catholics come out and say in 1965, life is inviolable from the exact point of conception, so therefore an abortion is murder, the Protestants react fairly badly to this. They don't buy it. They think it's papist. They think it's the sort of stuff that Catholics do. They're not particularly interested in it. So then the question is, where do the Protestants germinate their new attitude? And that new attitude is to align themselves with Catholicism and say, yes, we agree, life is inviolate from conception. And as Protestants, we will now protest outside of abortion clinics and medical centres that are addressing women who want to terminate their pregnancy. Now, this is a question that is extremely potent, and John Ronson is a very fine English journalist, and he does this very interesting podcast that I encourage you all to listen to. It's a podcast where Ronson attempts to understand, where does this right-wing conservative Protestant attitude to agreeing with the Catholic point of view come from? And it really doesn't come until 1977, when this Protestant Christian thinker, Francis Schaeffer, makes a movie. And that movie is then broadcast in stadiums to Protestant Christian groups all over the United States. And suddenly Protestants wake up to the fact that maybe abortion is wrong, in a very in the sense that it is murder. So please listen to John Ronson's podcast, which is here, as he traces this. And Frank Schaeffer is the son of Francis Schaeffer, and Frank was the one who made the film. And he suggested, almost out of the air, hey, Dad, why don't we do something to address abortion? So it's not as though the Frank who made the film, and maybe not even Francis, were totally committed to the idea that conception is the start of life. And yet by putting that into their film as a way of re-energizing Protestants in America, who they designed this film for, they changed the attitude of Americans on this issue. Can we go to the next slide where we continue this? Because I want to just give you one other example before I do a summary of these two things. And talk about organ donation. And this is a very interesting controversy, and I just want to give you some new insights into what's going on. I spend a reasonable amount of time with a group called the Jesus Christians, who are a fringe Christian group. They are fringe. You might have seen most recently Channel 7 Spotlight did a program on them as a mind-controlling cult. That was quite unfair. The Jesus Christians are a bunch of very intelligent people who have dedicated themselves to what they think is the life of Jesus, and they're trying to live what Jesus would do. But their leader, sometime at the start of the 21st century, read an article about how if you, having two kidneys, donate one of those kidneys to somebody who needs a kidney, that person will live. And the leader, Dave McKay, came up with the idea that maybe organ donation is representative of the sacrifice that Christ made when he was crucified on the cross. But this then takes some very interesting twists and turns, because standard issue Christians, not fringe Christians, think that maybe this is too much. It's interesting then to go back to John Ronson again, that great English journalist who wrote a very extensive article in The Guardian in 2002 called Blood Sacrifice, about the complexities of trying to live this Christian life of helping others to live. And you can see it in his article. You can also see it in a fascinating documentary that was made by the ABC in 2007 called Ash's Anatomy, where a young lad, Ash Falkingham, met Dave McKay and decided himself to donate a kidney to somebody who needed it. Now, most interestingly, the law prevented this from happening, because in New South Wales, there was no structure where you could give a non-directed kidney donation to a stranger. It was assumed that if I gave a kidney to a stranger, it was because that stranger had intimidated me, was blackmailing me, or had paid me a lot of money. The whole idea that a Christian act of altruism could take place was outside the scope of the understanding of law in New South Wales. The Jesus Christians petitioned a number of members of parliament in New South Wales and got that changed. So you can see that there is now, as of 2022, a New South Wales health policy on altruistic organ donations. But this would not have come about unless this fringe Christian group had said to government operatives, why can't we give one of our kidneys to somebody else in recognition of the sacrifice that Jesus made? This is a very interesting issue, which then leads us, when we're talking about bioethics, to a very interesting ingredient. So if we can go to the next slide, Joyce. What you're going to be asked to do when you're talking about organ donation or abortion is to talk about how a particular attitude relates to scripture. Now, that's fine, but I'm suggesting here you don't leave out the political. And the political is very interesting here, and you can make a comparison between new technological developments that represent what modernity is capable of, and traditional religious movements, Christianity being one of them, that pushes back against those modernist attitudes and those scientific developments. It's very interesting then that we have 1965, the Catholic Church says abortion is murder, but in the US, the last thing the American government wanted to do was to be a spokesperson for the policy of the Vatican and Rome and Catholics. So it's very interesting to see that in its own secular machinations, a case was brought to the Supreme Court, and we ended up with a ruling, Roe versus Wade, an extremely famous ruling from 1973, which said that any woman in the United States can have access to abortion. And that was legally determined as something that should be able to happen. And, you know, this was now done in a world where Protestant lawmakers thought that this idea that abortion is murder was a Catholic thing and not a Protestant thing. But interestingly, Francis Schaeffer's film, How Should We Then Live, which is pushing the message to Protestant communities that abortion is murder, um, then starts up a reaction among more conservative and right-wing Protestants in America that brings them around to the Catholic view. And it helps make abortion then one of the great dividing lines between the Christian right in America and more secular sentiment. So you get those horrendous protests outside of abortion clinics, literally blocking the clinic and trying to stop women going in to get abortions because they believe that everybody is responsible for stopping that kind of murder. And that attitude then flowed through to under Donald Trump, who was able to put some more right-leaning judges onto the Supreme Court, led in 2022 to Roe v. Wade being overturned. Interestingly, very soon after that, in France, which celebrates its modernity and its secularity, not only can you get an abortion in France, but then the French Senate in March of this year pushed that into not just law, but into the very matrix of the French Republican Constitution. So now that it is a constitutional right in France for a woman to seek an abortion. So you can see that there is some political activity as a dimension to this historical, religious, scriptural, and technological development on this side. Similarly, with organ donation, we have a fringe Christian group, the Jesus Christians, suggesting that kidney donation will save the lives of strangers and is a way of acting out Jesus' sacrifice. But we find in the media take that to then declare this group to be, quote, a satanic kidney cult. And if you go anywhere near the Jesus Christians, they will make sure that you lose a kidney somehow or other. So keep away from them. And you can see other power structures at work here as the Jesus Christians' voice is occluded, even though they did some good work and they got the law changed in New South Wales. We need to obliterate them because they are a non-normative experience of Christianity, and we'll just call them a satanic kidney cult. But in response to Jesus' Christian advocacy, New South Wales establishes protocols for non-directed kidney donation and so forth. There is also, you might want to follow this up. This is not connected to the Jesus Christians, but there was an interesting advertising campaign for organ donation suggesting that Jesus would have donated his organs. And it's very interesting that it is Christians in particular who organize a petition to have that, what they call blasphemous organ donating campaign taken off air because they didn't want Jesus used as a spokesperson for organ donation. So I'm giving you these examples to throw you into the political complexities of these issues. So you can just add in a sentence here and there a little extra dimension to what you will find online about people, teachers in particular, telling you how to address the syllabus. Don't be afraid to mention also the political. I think then, Joyce and Charlotte, that takes us to the last slide, which is, don't forget my glorious textbook, which I've written. I put the words together. Jonathan Noble, who was until recently head teacher of studies of religion at Xavier College up in Newcastle. He's an Anglican minister who was head teacher of studies of religion at one of the major Catholic schools in Newcastle. John is great for setting up exercises and understanding the pedagogical structure of the syllabus. So this is a really good book. You can buy. I shouldn't tell you this because I won't get any royalties out of it, but you can buy copies of this on eBay and so forth. So you can get yourself a copy that way as well. And I will be part of the team because I'm vitally interested in getting you to look to sources and quote sources and footnote sources. So we are running an articulate writing skills workshop on Thursday, the 27th of June, and I will be a part of the team of most excellent colleagues who are also going to look at writing for the HSC, writing with AI in the world, and also writing with footnotes. So hopefully you can come to that as well. Thank you for listening to my rant. Hopefully it was helpful.
Thank you so much, Grace. Always interesting hearing you present on these topics. And thank you so much for also talking about the writing skills workshop. I can see that we've already received a couple of Q&A questions. So, Grace, I'll go ahead and start reading these out. So the first one that has come through is, what role do you think Italian religious painters like Caravaggio had in the continuation of Christian doctrine and also exploring the syncretism between Christianity and Roman, Greek, Zoroastrianism, and Egyptian religion?
Well, I went to my cousin, who was about the same age as me, died, and I went to her funeral down in Cooma a few years ago. And unfortunately, the mass that I stepped into, because she was a very good Catholic, that side of the family remained very good Catholics. It was all guitars and singing, and there was no Mozart and there was no Caravaggio. And I like that older Rome where the artists of Italy, in particular, in the 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, developed a brilliant language for impactfully driving home to you the emotive power of the Christian story. And we have to remember that this is in a time where Catholicism was, well, it remains today a universal force, and that is that it appeals to the literate and also the non-literate. When you go into some of these churches in Rome, you are visually overwhelmed by the art that is up on the walls. And that's part of Catholicism's appeal to the non-literate. Martin Luther, as I said, turns Christianity into a strictly, well, a very, not exactly strictly, but a very focused movement on the text and how you read the text yourself as a way of understanding what commitments you need to make to Jesus and to the community. Catholicism needs this visual art in a way that I think if you go into some Protestant churches, the Quaker Meeting House in Devonshire Street, for example, there are almost no images at all because the focus is on the word rather than on the image. So that's that part. Was there syncretism with Roman traditions, with Greek traditions? There certainly were, also Zoroastrian, also mystery cults. So if you follow those links that I've given you in that section of the slide, that will further explain what's going on there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And as I said, we'll send this as a PDF to everyone so you can go in and have a look at the links as well. Just a follow-up question from Rosie as well, Chris. What does Paul say about secularism?
Um, I don't know if there was secularism in the Roman Empire. There was the cult of the emperor, and there were imperial cults. And Augustus, more than any of the other emperors, sort of like solidified his grip on the empire because Rome before him was a republic. He turns it into an imperial modality through religion. So he revivifies the religious life of the Roman Empire. He gives new life to the Pontifex Maximus and the Flavian Dialis. These are high priesthoods and religious orders that connected to Rome. Moreover, Rome was the sort of place where when the Romans invaded a new place, they invited the gods of that new territory or that new place to come and be worshipped at Rome. So if you think about Rome, it is really not secular. It is a cornucopia of religious traditions and of different temples and of all sorts of modalities of belief that are taking place. So I don't know if we could use the word secular really until we start getting towards the constitutions that are guaranteeing us secularity that are coming out of the American Revolution and the French Revolution circa 1789 and beyond. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And last question, when discussing about bioethics and our responses, what are some things we should refrain from saying, or what can we add to make our responses more firm?
Thank you. So I was going to put in a slide. There's a discipline called phenomenology, which we use at the university here, where you're looking at the phenomena of life, what people do, how they're doing it. And I write something on the chat, Joyce, because it's a bit of a weird word,
Yeah,
but
of course, we'll copy it
empoché.
across.
So there it is, empoché, which is coming up under DC. Empoché is just the French word for pocket. But phenomenologists in their methodology say that the best way to approach an understanding of the of the world, is to take all of your own personal views and put them in a pocket, sort of like sterilize them, as it were, keep them away from um, your understanding of the phenomena that you're looking at. So I would suggest to you, particularly when addressing hot button topics like organ donation, because when I read about organ donation, I can feel those organs in my body as I'm reading about it. You know, I can have a very visceral reaction when I'm talking about organ donation. Similarly, when I'm talking about abortion, I'm very much a person who sits on the fence. I do not have strong views either way about abortion, which in itself some people would take to be an untenable position. So what I do is I take those personal attitudes and I put them in my little phenomenological pocket, and then I just look and write about what other people are doing and saying and how that relates to scripture, religious community, power, and a whole range of other phenomena. So that's how I kind of have a bit of scholarly distance on these issues, rather than using the I persona, saying I feel, I believe. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. And this will be our last question. What are the general trends of Christian attitudes to difficult pregnancies, where to continue the pregnancy will endanger the life of the mother who is given preference?
This is a really difficult question, and you need to go from faith-based group to faith-based group to see what their attitudes are on this. Some right-wing Christian groups in America will say that all abortion is wrong, and that if there are late-term problems with the pregnancy, then it is up to God, and it is quite acceptable for God to take from the earth both the mother and the child. But as you move more towards the liberal spectrum of Christianity, and even if you look at some of the more sophisticated approaches to abortion, which you find in Judaism, when the mother's life is put at risk, even though birth is a very special moment, where pregnancy is a very special part of the cycle of life, there may come times where medical science needs to intervene. And it's very interesting that the Catholics are using, the Old Testament, which is Jewish scripture to justify the Vatican II attitude to abortion, whereas Jews have a much more sophisticated attitude to their own scripture regarding when a mother is threatened, or when there are other conditions of abortion, then maybe that abortion should be allowed to proceed. It's an interesting way of reading Jewish scripture / the Old Testament from a Catholic perspective, in contradistinction to a Jewish attitude.
Thank you so much for this. Thank you everyone for your questions. If you wanted to stay up to date with upcoming opportunities or events, you could also sign up to our Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences Participate High School newsletter. This is where we advertise events like this, like the one we had just had now as well. We have a few upcoming particular talks in June. So the first one will be English, where we'll talk about Billy Elliot, and also the writing skills workshop that Chris mentioned before on the 27th of June. And I highly recommend that you come along to that one as well. That's it from us. Thank you so much. And I would like to wish you all the best with your upcoming assessment tasks, and have a lovely night ahead.